migration pattern in a developing country context. And so what I'm doing in this paper is that I'm estimating the effect of new electricity transmission infrastructure on internal migration using a household panel that tracks each individual of the household over time. The context is Nigeria from 2009 to 2016. And for the identification, for the identification, I rely, first of all, on large-scale infrastructure changes and look at transient households that were not directly targeted by the policy by controlling for important geographic covariates, such as the distance to the closest substation. And then I'm also constructing a hypothetical least cost grid path for the transmission grid to isolate supply side factors of the grid. And then in the end of the paper, I also have a few results on a gravity model of migration to look at the interaction of the migration effect from electricity infrastructure and other pull factors of migration. And so here is a map of the main data sources that I'm using. So in black, you can see the transmission lines that already existed in the beginning of my observation period. And then in red, you can see the transmission lines that were newly constructed during the observation period. And so for anyone who isn't really familiar with electricity and how the electricity infrastructure works, so usually you have these large scale infrastructure, these transmission lines that transport high voltages over large distances, and they connect different substations that you can see here in yellow. And at the points of the yellow substations, the electricity is then converted to lower voltages and fed into a distribution grid that then connects the households to the grid. So of course, the location of the substations is endogenous. And they are usually located in sort of centers of high economic activity. This is why it's very important to control for the distance to one of these substations. Yeah, and in blue you can see where the household sample is located. So the model is a first difference model with state wave fixed effects and location specific time constant control variables. And the main regressor is a binary variable that indicates whether or not a household was located within 15 kilometers of a new transmission line. So in this model, I'm basically comparing households that were close to a new transmission line to those that were not close to a new transmission line in the same state in the same year, which would control for sort of state budget related reasons why a new transmission grid was constructed in this state in this year. And I'm controlling also for location specific time constant controls such as distance to the closest substation. So I'm comparing households that were at an equal distance located to a substation. And so the identification assumption would be violated if the path between two substations was also endogenously determined. So we can imagine that, for instance, here, this red transmission line was newly constructed, and you can see it has a sort of bump upwards. If the community living here in the north was politically or economically more important, then there would be a bias in the estimate. And that's why, in addition to controlling for the control variables and the fixed effects, I constructed a hypothetical least cost path that is based on a paper by Faber 2014, who invented this approach for road infrastructure that basically isolates the supply side factors of constructing infrastructure by looking at the characteristics of the terrain. And in this case, you can see in orange how the hypothetical least cost path would look like. and it would just be a straight line. So it seems that the terrain here between these two transmission substations is very even, and it would be cheapest to just construct a straight line. And so this is what I'm using as an instrumental variable. And so at the household level, the first results on household composition show that indeed I can observe a reduction in household members after the construction of the transmission lines by 0.6 to 0.7 household members. And on average, in Nigeria, you have 6 persons living in one household. So that's approximately 10% of household members leaving the household. And this effect is partly driven by children, particularly older teenagers, so children aged 13 to 18. And here it's important to consider that 15 is already considered working age in Nigeria. So this is not only probably linked to education, but also income generating activities. At the individual level, one can also see that the individual migration propensity increases by quite a lot. So at baseline, we have only a 2% probability that a household member leaves the household in a given period, and this increases by 5%. And then if you look at the individual role that a person holds within the household, you see that household migration from household heads does not change. But the children of the household heads are more likely to leave the household. So they are either creating their own household somewhere else, or they're just leaving to live with other family members somewhere else. And so as a channel, I'm showing you here the results on employment. And on average, you can see that for all individuals, I don't find an effect on employment. But for the household head, there are very clear effects. So for the household head, the likelihood to work in non-farm employment increases by 12%. And also the working hours, the weekly working hours increase by between 6 to 8 working hours per week. And again, we don't see any increases in employment for other members of the household, so neither for the spouse nor for the children of the household head.
Just under 5 minutes.
Now for the gravity model, I see that that indeed the so this is now at municipality level, that municipalities that just received new grid infrastructure show an increase in migration outflows. And if you then split the sample by municipalities that have received a new grid in column 2 and that have not received a new grid in the last period in column 1, you see that also the covariates differ a bit. So the significance or the effect of log distance, which is usually a measure for migration costs, is lower for origins that have just received new grid. So migrants are able to migrate over longer distances, which might also be due to budget reasons of the household. And these migrants are more likely to select destinations that are that have more cropland and have less urban land, and that have also just received new grid infrastructure. So summing up, the positive shock from the electric infrastructure led to an increase in employment of the household head, but not of employment for other household members. Instead, I can observe an increase of out-migration of the children of the household head. And as an implication, this suggests that in the presence of ex-ante credit constraints, the productivity gains from infrastructure can result in an increase of out-migration. And this is, I think, relevant for policymakers because it might, in the long or medium run, lead to a lower development path for these regions, because there might in the medium to long run appear a shortage of labor supply actually in these regions. And so it's important to also understand whether or not these migrants return, or how these migration patterns develop in the long run. And I think this is potential for future work. And the findings from the gravity model suggest that the electricity shock also affected the ordinal preferences for destinations. Okay, that's it. So we will have the discussion after all of the presentations. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Okay.
And thank you, that was fantastic.
Thank you.
Next up, we'll have Simon talking about urban public works. I think we might have lost Simon for a second. No, Simon's back.
I had sun full on my face and I wanted to not have that during the talk. Let me share my screen. Make it full screen. Can you all see that? Great. Okay. So this paper, in a nutshell, is about how to estimate kind of equilibrium effects of social programs, and in particular wage labor market effects of those programs, when the effects could spill over across locations. So we think of social programs often as having many kinds of spillover effects. Today we're going to be studying public works programs, and those have been shown in existing literature already to have effects both on local amenities through the public works that are actually done by participants in the program, and then also effects on private sector wages, because these programs withdraw people from the private sector labor market in order to do the public works in the first place. Okay, and so we want to study those effects and get a sense of how large they are, but this is really challenging for the traditional reasons, right? Because to estimate anything, you need some randomized or naturally occurring variation, but you need to evaluate programs at scale if you want to evaluate these equilibrium effects. And that's the first challenge that's been hard to get for these kinds of programs anywhere. But we think there's an additional challenge, which is that these effects may spill over across units of randomization. So in rural areas, we might not think of this as such a big problem. One rural district might be hundreds of kilometers away from another, and therefore not likely to really be affected by that district being treated. But in urban areas or more densely connected, developed areas, those connections are likely to be quite strong. So for example, commuting to work across districts of a city mean that the effects of a program rolled out in one district of the city is likely to affect the labor market everywhere in the city. So normally people have tried to kind of impose kind of parametric solutions to this. But we think this is going to be difficult to do, again, in an urban setting where people are commuting all over the place. It's not obvious how you should parameterize these spillovers. There's an additional problem that these spillovers, you then need to think about what they're going to look like when you go from the partial rollout that you need for your evaluation to the full-scale rollout. And so for all of these issues, what we think is that we need some kind of model to get at this problem. And so that's the way we're going with this paper today. We're going to kind of combine traditional randomized rollout RCT analysis of a program at scale with a spatial equilibrium model in order to take into account these spillover effects that are going to make estimation hard and also give us an incorrect estimate of the welfare effects of a program if we don't take them into account. Okay, so the context is Ethiopia, the Urban Safety Net program in the city of Addis Ababa. We are going to exploit the randomized rollout of the program, where 40% of the neighborhoods get it in the first year randomly. We collect our own primary survey data, which is very comprehensive and focuses on the things that we need to measure, commuting and neighborhood quality in particular, which are not traditionally collected in these kinds of surveys. We're going to start by showing kind of basic what we call ITT estimates, just the effect of living in a treated neighborhood of the program. And that's going to give us a guide to where we want to go as we develop the spatial equilibrium model, which is really quite simple. All it's really going to do is give us a way to identify the spatial spillovers of the program through the commuting network using the commuting data we have. And then if you believe the model, it's going to take us to the next step of allowing us to quantify the total welfare effects of the program and do counterfactual simulations of different types of program analysis. Okay, and so we think we're kind of contributing to research on the effects of social programs and spatial equilibrium in cities, but we also think there's a connection to, kind of the analysis in labor economics on the propagation of local labor market shocks that are place-based or targeted to a certain location, but may propagate throughout the labor market. And so we're providing a slightly different approach to do that draws on the urban literature to tackle the problem. Okay, so I don't have much time to tell you a lot about the program, except to say that it's very generous. It's rolled out at the household level. It's not randomized at the household level. The targeting is done by communities. The randomization is done at the neighborhood level. And the public works is done locally. So it's kind of improving the local amenities or local public goods in a location, cleaning the streets, sewages, and those sorts of things. We start with this survey of 6,000 households that is representative of representative of poor households within the city. And it's also going to focus on both people who are eligible for the program, and so actually get the program in the end, and people who are ineligible, so non-beneficiaries of the program, within treated and untreated areas. Okay, then the randomized rollout happens, and we follow up 1 year into the program and collect all this data on outcomes at end line, including this amenity index, which captures the five components that we think are going to be improved by the public works program by nature of the work that's actually done. Okay, I'll skip through some of the data. That's what the city looks like with the randomization outcome. Orange locations are treated over there. So let me show you the intention to treat estimates. So this is what you would do in a traditional approach, just looking at residents living in I and regressing their outcomes on whether their location I is treated or not. And we're going to start by doing that just to see what happens to people living in treated areas. Because of course, you can only be in the program if you live in a treated area. So we start by looking at employment outcomes in this reduced form analysis. The main takeaway is that this program provides a lot of public employment. So 4.6% of people's total time across all people in these treated areas, that time is spent on public works. But what's striking is that it's crowded out 1-for-1 from a reduction in private sector work. Okay, so this is for every hour that is spent on the public works, an hour less is spent doing private employment by the households that are in the public works. We also see this large impact on neighborhood amenities for people who live in areas where the public works is happening. So that's 0.6 standard deviations of our index of the quality of the neighborhood. And what's reassuring is that these results hold when we break it down by eligible and ineligible households. So both types of households notice these big improvements to their neighborhoods, but the labor supply effects that we documented are concentrated entirely amongst the eligible households, as we would expect. They're the ones that can no longer work in the private sector because they're doing the public works. Okay, so I haven't shown you anything on wages yet because we don't think it's appropriate to do that. We don't think that we can show you those results because they're going to be biased downwards because of these commuting flows across neighborhoods. I'm also not going to show you the model in great detail, except to say that it comes very much out of the standard urban spatial equilibrium literature with very few amendments. And in that model, we can characterize the effects of the public works, and we also get an expression for the welfare effects of the program. Okay, so look in the paper for more details there. I'm going to skip over it. When we get to the quantitative analysis that's guided by the model, we've got 4 main steps. And I want to start and concentrate on step 1, which is estimating these labor market spillovers, the labor market effects of the program. So again, this is what we would do in the reduced form world, looking at the wages of people living in I as a function of being in a treated area I. And we're going to say that, and the model tells us, and that gives us an expression for how we should actually do this, that is very different. And we're going to say it should actually look something like the second expression. So instead of looking at wages of people living in I, we need to look at the wages of people working in J, okay? So we know where people work from in our survey data. So we're going to impute their wages to their destination of work. We're going to regress those wages at destination on the exposure of that destination to the program. So not just whether that destination is in the program or not, but whether it is, you know, exposed to some degree or other to the program. And exposure is going to be defined in terms of how many workers who are coming into that neighborhood from outside are no longer doing so because they are treated, because they are now in the program and therefore reducing their labor supply to that location. Okay, and so this tells us that, you know, both treated and untreated locations can be affected by the program because they can both have had workers coming in or out who may no longer be doing it. One big caveat here is that we need to recenter this this exposure measure according to the recent literature from the trade literature to account for the fact that even if treatment is randomized, which it is, the commuting shares are not, and therefore we need to recenter it such that we can actually, this exposure measure is as good as randomly assigned, which is what we want. So this is causally identified. Okay, this is a graphical representation of the results. We are showing the correlation between exposure to the program, exposure of the labor market, J, and the log wages in that destination. And we break it down by treated and control labor markets. And so you can see in both treated and controlled labor markets separately, there is a strong correlation between the exposure to the program through the commuting network and log wages, okay, such that the more exposed you are, the higher wages are because you've had a larger negative labor supply shock. And so that holds both in treatment and control areas, which is kind of the intuition that we really wanted to capture with this paper, which is that even if you're not in the program, but you're a neighbor of a place that is, you're affected through commuting. Okay, and so when we move to showing the formal regression results, the first 2 columns show these naive results where we look at origins, and the two last columns show when we move to this labor market destination-based analysis, and we see that the effect of exposure to the program is twice as large when we take into account commuting flows because we're no longer subject to this bias. Okay. And just to give you a sense of it, so, you know, exposure to the program is much higher in treated areas than in control areas. And wages therefore increase a lot more in treated areas, but they still do increase significantly in control areas as well as in treated areas, something that we would have missed if we hadn't done this analysis. Okay. So the next bit is we put a monetary value, or we try to put a kind of a better estimate of how important these improvements in amenities are. And so we say that this index that's affected by the public works, which increases by 0.6, corresponds to a 2.5% overall increase in amenity when we use these kind of hedonic regressions to get a sense of how important this improvement is in monetary terms. And so that's another important thing we're going to need for welfare. Finally, we need a commuting elasticity from the gravity model, which is going to also be the last piece of the puzzle to estimate welfare coming out of our model. Okay, and so that's the last step. We put it all together in an expression for welfare that combines improved amenities in places where the programs are rolled out, the direct effects, which is the wages, the actual money being received by recipients in the program, and then these wage effects, which are a function of how much wages improve in all destinations, all labor markets across the city, and then how much access you as individual I have to all those labor markets. So again, even if you're not living in an area exposed to the program, you can travel to that place and benefit from higher wages there, subject to commuting costs, which is why we need this commuting elasticity estimate. Okay, and so we put it all together and we get the final thing. Have a look in the paper if you want the minute details. But in short, we're finding significantly larger welfare effects once we take these spillover effects into account. They're kind of orders of magnitude larger than the direct effects alone. So we're glad that we didn't miss those. And also, we're finding that these effects are in control areas as well as treated areas, something, again, that we would have missed if we had just looked at a treatment control comparison. And finally, when we get to the full rollout of the program, so when all the areas in the city get it, the direct effects stay the same, of course, because it's the same transfer to each household in the program. But the indirect effects get magnified because the saturation of the program across the whole labor market in the city increases so much. And the last point that we make is that if we compared this to cash transfers, just giving people the same monetary amount that they're given for doing the public works, but without a work requirement and without the public works component that's being rolled out, we estimate that welfare would be significantly lower, both in the partial and full rollout. Okay, so yeah, the paper's got a lot more details on this and some maps of showing how these welfare effects are distributed across the city, confirming this intuition that they're larger in treated areas than in control areas, but both treated and control areas benefit to differing degrees depending on their connection to the rest of the city through commuting. Okay, so I think I've given a sense of it. No need to really sum up, but I'm very happy to hear questions later and get your feedback. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Simon. Perfectly timed. Next up, then we have Ida.
Yeah, let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, you should all be seeing that by now. Yeah, all good. Perfect. So this paper actually originally came out of my master's dissertation here at the economics department at Oxford, but together with my co-author Jin Kim, we have extended that, and it really is a story about worker exploitation. So situations where firms hold monopsony power over labor, and in particular, a very unique case of that, which is the Hukou system in China, which restricts access to social safety nets by particular groups. So just to give you a bit of context on what the Hukou system is and why it matters for labor market outcomes, it's basically a registration system established by the Communist Party back in the 50s, so quite an old piece of legislation. Its original function was to regulate or completely restrict migration, as well as allocate state resources. This is all planned economy times, so the state is assigning food rations and housing. But the main dimension along which it's determined, it's either rural or urban, and it's actually based on when your parents are registered. So if your parents were registered in rural areas, you automatically get assigned a rural Hukou status, and then similarly with the urban status. And the person's Hukou status then determines access to absolutely every single social safety net you can imagine in the economy. So from a labor market, education, healthcare, insurance, it's all tied to the Hukou status. Now it's obviously digitized. This is like the old school version of how it looked like. This little red booklet quite literally determined people's life outcomes in terms of their access to safety nets. And why does it matter in terms of labor markets? The Hukou system really is a major source of inequality in China. So in our data, we find that urban Hukou holders earn 35% more than rural Hukou holders. They also have a 17% higher mean educational level, but even after we control for education, there's a range of anecdotal evidence on the kind of discrimination and exploitation of rural Hukou holders in city. I guess the most graphic example of that are these like Foxconn factories where workers work 16 hours. But within the context of a research question, we really see this as a crucial labor market friction. So we have this disadvantaged group of workers in the labor market. Specifically, they are the rural Hukou holders that have migrated into cities but are still registered in the rural areas and therefore cannot access any of the social safety nets and cannot protect themselves against employers. And so firms exploit that. And so we're trying to see the Hukou reform as a removal of that crucial labor market frictions. And we're trying to ask what happens to firms what are the implications for firm behavior? And there is very little evidence on that so far. So how did the reform look like? It was very uneven. So even though in 2001, China announced this nationwide reform of the Hukou system, cities adopted at different times. And the trick is that not all of them actually adopted, at least not during our sample period. So we are able to kind of exploit that quasi-natural experiment, and we can compare firms in cities that adopted the reform to firms in cities that did not adopt the reform. So we're doing like a multiple period case of a difference in difference. And on the map, you can see color-coded the kind of reform year assigned to each cities. And we identify 80 altogether that reformed the system. And when I say reform, that really means they either abolished the rural-urban distinction altogether, so it didn't matter, you could just access healthcare education in the same way, or they allowed for easier transfers of the status, so there was less admin surrounding the kind of process of transitioning for your status. So what we do, we try and analyze the effect of that reform on firms' behavior. And our main outcome of interest will be monopsony, which we understand to be firms' wage setting power that they hold over with labor. But we also look at other outcomes. So firm productivity, how does that affect exit, what happens to employment and wages and benefits. Without going into too much detail, there is an equilibrium search model that we build. You can look it up in the paper or in the appendix, and it gives us some equilibrium solution that has predictions about what will happen in the economy. But let me focus on the empirical results. So our specification is a difference in difference. We'll always be comparing firms in reform cities to firms in non-reform cities to capture like the net effect of the reform. And we use two data sets, firm level panel spanning over 10 years and a cross-sectional household level data to complement that. In terms of contribution, there's probably two main areas. They are both in the title. So the first one is of course monopsony power. So in the past, we've thought about the factors that can create monopsony power. That's related to search frictions, lack of job mobility. There has been work on kind of international migrants and how they are a separate labor market segment. And more recently, whether minimum wage can affect monopsony power. So here we're looking at it from a slightly different angle, which is how the actions of the state can create monopsony, because it really is an institutional barrier created by the Chinese state that disadvantages these rural Hukou holders. And that hasn't really been explored. And then the Hukou system itself, most of the information that we have about it come from household level data. So we know that migrants' employment outcomes are worse. Here I mean rural urban migrants, so I'm always talking in the context of internal migration, and that they face discrimination in the labor market. But there's much less that is known about kind of firm level responses. Actually, we're only aware of one paper, which is the Wang 2021, and they look at firm level employment adjustment. So looking at the data, the first one is the Chinese Annual Survey of Industrial Firms, probably the most comprehensive firm level panel for China, spanning 1998 to 2007 from the NBS, covers 95% of industrial output and 98% of industrial exports, and it has all the balance sheet information. So revenues, costs, worker remuneration, we can estimate the production function from that as well. But what it doesn't have is information about worker characteristics. So from this data set alone, we cannot identify exactly who is exploited or like what are their characteristics. So we complement that with household level data, which is a cross-section for the same time period from the Chinese Household Income Project. And a useful feature of that data for our purposes is that in addition to having information about socio-demographic characteristics and the usual kind of module and consumption income, they also have detailed information about the Hukou status. So we can say exactly who the rural Hukou holders are who migrated into cities. It's all also georeferenced, so we can match these with reform and non-reform cities. And how we actually measure monopsony, this is a very intuitive kind of approach to it. Pego's-E really just captures the gap between the marginal productive labor and wage. So if you think about this benchmark textbook economics scenario of a perfectly competitive labor market, you should always be paid your marginal productive labor, so this gap would be 0. So we're benchmarking the case where Pego's-E is 0 in the case of no monopsony power. And then whenever the gap arises and the marginal productive labor is actually larger than the wage, then we interpret that as firms holding wage setting power over labor. But this measure is imperfect in the sense that there's different reasons why there could be a gap, right? Like there could also be distortions in the output market. So we adopt another measure that is arguably more robust, where we're trying to capture or filter out this distortion in the output market. So we use the concept of a markup, so the output elasticity of an input over its share of expenditure and the firm's total revenues. And again, we take a benchmark case of materials or intermediate inputs as the case of no monopsony power. So we think that firms cannot influence the price of their inputs in the input market for materials. So this markup would only be capturing the distortion in the output market for materials. So if we compare the labor markup to the material markup, we are really filtering out the distortion in the output market. So if there's no monopsony in the labor market, this markdown, this ratio of markups should be 1. And if it's bigger than 1, then something else is going on, and we interpret that as being monopsony power. In terms of identification strategy, like I mentioned, it's a difference in difference. So we are interested in this beta 1 over here. Like I mentioned, the cities implemented the reform at different times. So we are always comparing firms in reform cities to non-reform cities, but it's just a special case where we code the dummy as equal to 1 if the reform is actually in place in that year and 0 otherwise. So we're also including fixed effects to control for any kind of time invariant characteristics that could be confounding identification. We have firm level, year level fixed effects, firm level controls. So these would be age of the firm to proxy for experience, log of sales. And I guess a big problem in this case is that the reform could be non-random. So like cities that are more economically developed might have an incentive or for other political reasons to just adopt the reform and attract more labor. So we try and control for that using city level controls. So log of per capita GDP and share of non-agricultural population, as well as the regional trend. And we run a bunch of robustness checks. They're on the paper. So pre-trend analysis and a falsification test. And what do we find? The main results are related to the emergence of monopsony power, or rather the decline in monopsony power. So actually allowing access to benefits for this marginalized group by reforming this ancient kind of institutional barrier that was preventing them from accessing safety nets before, allows them to protect themselves better against employer exploitation. So we see that firms in reform cities see their P/E decrease relative to firms in non-reform cities. So this gap between marginal productive labor and wage is getting smaller, like they're more aligned. And so there's a negative impact of the Hukou reform on monopsony power. And this is robust across specifications. So even if we add city controls, even if we control for the regional trend, that still holds. But to kind of make it more robust, even we test this against the measure of the markdown. So our alternative kind of variable for capturing monopsony. The ACF and the CRS just means there's different ways in which we estimated the markdown, and that depends on our assumptions about the production function. And that can all be found in the appendix as well. But yeah, overwhelmingly, we do find a negative and statistically significant effect, except for one specification, but we still think this is sufficiently robust to conclude that there's a negative effect of monopsony on markdowns. And beyond the kind of impact on monopsony, we also think about firm exit. So in this case, we have aggregated this variable at the city year industry level. So what we're really trying to see is whether firms in reform cities relative to non-reform cities, whether more firms are exiting by industry. And we do find a positive kind of impact on that as well. And not only do more firms exit, but we are able to confirm in the data that they're specifically the least productive firms. So there's also some kind of a productivity impact on the economy. And that is consistent with our micro level results as well. So we do see a positive impact on the average and the marginal productive labor. Here, the marginal productive labor just comes from a production function estimation. Again, here maybe it's important to note that it's not robust to the inclusion of regional trends. So there could be some pre-trends in these outcome variables. And finally, the result from our household level data, we're really trying to specifically see what happens to the rural Hukou holders, so identify these workers. And so we run a regression on the log of salary or earnings. By the way, salary also includes benefits, so like housing insurance, medical insurance, all of that. So it's not just the wage that they're getting paid. And we see quite a big effect, so 135 to 159% increase, which is obviously massive, but then it's over 10 years. So from 1999 to 2008, and it's broadly in line with the kind of pace of growth of wages in China at the time. I think this still is a feasible estimate. And I guess the main concern here is that what if it's just education driving it? Because we also saw that the urban Hukou holders are more educated, So it could just be unrelated to the Hukou status. So we control for education as well to kind of account for that possibility. We control for age, for sex, and for whether the person is married. And then we include city and year fixed effects and city level controls. Yeah, just a quick wrap up. We've looked at the Hukou reform, which really is quite a unique institutional barrier to labor mobility, if you want to think about it that way. And the reform really just means there's an easier movement of people across cities, but more importantly, it means that they now have access to social safety nets. So people that were registered in rural areas and migrated into cities previously were not able to access education and healthcare. They were not able to protect themselves against employers, but now after the reform, they kind of improve that access. And what that does is it decreases monopsony powers. So we find that the firms hold less wage setting power over labor, more firms leave the market, and most specifically, the least productive ones leave, which actually is quite a significant result in the case of aggregate. If we think about aggregate productivity in the economy, we find that firms were more productive, and the rural Hukou holders, which was our disadvantaged group in the labor market, actually earned more as a result. And the implications, I guess there's a growing recognition that labor markets could be monopsonistic in developing countries. So any research kind of going into other developing country contexts would be useful as well as identifying the factors that can influence it. And I guess how should we be thinking about the provision of social safety nets? In particular, if there is a group of marginalized workers, in our case, this was the rural Hukou holders, we could easily imagine them to be other socioeconomic groups. So women, international migrants as well. And finally, whether the removal of these barriers to access to safety nets has anything to do with productivity in the economy. So we do actually also find that it's related to aggregate productivity. Yeah, happy to answer any questions, whatever the format is. I think you just type them to the chat, so I'll let the next person go. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eva. And that's right. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll get to them right at the end. We have one final presentation from Joao.
So good afternoon from sunny Lisbon. So this is a joint work with Lara Bonnet and Susana Peralta. And in this paper, we ask what were the labor market impacts of the inflow of close to 500,000 repatriates that happened in a country that in the 1970s had around 9 million people. To answer this question, we will use very rich individual level census data that we have for all the repatriates, and we are going to combine that with detailed regional level data for the natives. And we will use a natural experiment that comes from the eruption that happened after the Portugal granting independence to its former African colonies. And so there was an eruption in civil wars in these places, and close to 500,000 people run back to Portugal. And we will use for identification shift share IVs, where we exploiting the places of birth of these repatriates. Most of them were still born in Portugal. Just a very quick preview of our results. So we find substantial gender differences, with women absorbing the bulk of the shock, native women. So for native workers of both genders, they were driven out of employment as employees, but the effect is much bigger for males than for females. And moreover, men are able to partially compensate for these losses by moving into self-employment, but women, they basically go out of the labor market and move to inactivity. So there's a growing importance of return migration in the development migration cycle, but we still have very little evidence on the impact of this phenomenon. So we believe that this case study is interesting because, first of all, it was a very large and concentrated inflow of people. So the repatriates increased the workforce on average per municipality by about 3.9%, but in some places they increased the workforce by more than 15%. This was very it was largely unpredictable and happened in between 1974 and 1976. It was mainly concentrated in 75 and 76. And another difference to what we usually find in the literature is that this return migration is of very close substitutes to natives. So most of the repatriates had been born in Portugal. They shared the same language, religion, culture, and so on. On top of that, these migrants were far more educated than the large majority of the Portuguese of the natives. So they were far more educated. They had more skilled occupations and so on. And finally, there's little migration among return migrants. So it means that basically everyone that was living in former colonies returned to Portugal to escape the civil wars. Just very quickly, some background. So in the 1960s and 1970s, there starts a colonial wars in Angola, Mozambique, and other Portuguese-speaking areas in Africa. These wars were the military expenditures in the year before the revolution in Portugal. They made up to close to 50% of government expenditures. So this was a huge effort to have a war playing in 3 or 4 theaters of operations. And then to finish this war, there is a military coup in Portugal that is known as the Carnation Revolution. And this puts an end to Western Europe's longest dictatorship, and also to a colonial war that lasted more than a decade. And in 1974, when it was the Portuguese that were living in these areas, it was initially they thought that they could stay. Then there's the civil wars that erupt in these places that led hundreds of thousands of ethnic Portuguese to flee to Portugal. As you can imagine, this process was completely chaotic. So it had to happen like in just 2 years. The Portuguese government had to initiate a very large scale program to assist repatriates in their arrival. And if we look just a few years after, this is considered to be a success story, but this hides a lot of negative stereotyping that existed at the time, where repatriates were basically portrayed as stealing housing and jobs from the natives. So what we do to answer this question on the labor market impact of this shock. So we have data on all the repatriates. This is coming from the census in 1981. This was retrieved by a sociologist, and we have data on the age and gender, education, places of birth, as well as the place of residence in 1981 for all the repatriates. And we are able to combine these with information that we have at the municipal level for natives. And we have pre-shock data at around 1960. And we are going to compare these differences in regions with the census data again in 1981 on the post-shock. So what are we going to do? So these are basically first differences measured at the municipality and in NUTS2R. We are going to have some NUTS2 fixed effects, and our measure of interest is going to be this beta, which is basically the impact of a higher share of repatriates. Everything is going to be conditional on a share of a share of municipal level controls measured at the beginning of the shock. So for our outcomes, we are going to evaluate the labor force participation. All of this is going to be separate for both genders. So it's going to be the labor force participation. If someone is in the labor force, you could be either employed or unemployed. If someone is employed, they could be working as employee, so working for other people, or they could be entrepreneurs. And then we are also going to see if the share of entrepreneurs, like high quality entrepreneurs, meaning that they have some employees, so they are employers, or if they are low quality entrepreneurs, if they are measured like as self-employed. So it's given the way that we estimate, so our measure, the repatriates per municipality divided by the natives in 1981, you can see on your right the spatial distribution. So it's not the case that repatriates were, the return was only concentrated in Lisbon, so there's a huge geographic dispersion on these numbers, especially so the two big areas are Lisbon and this part in the north of the country. But you could fear that this measure would suffer from endogeneity problems, at least for two reasons. It could be that the repatriates choose places that are with better labor market conditions a priori, and it could also be that natives respond to this influx of people by moving out of these areas. So to deal with this issue, we have to construct instruments that predict the location of repatriates, and we do so by using their places of birth. So this is a good idea as long as it affects the subsequent settlement decision upon return, and we are going to show that. And it has to be exogenous to outcomes conditional on our series of controls. So how are we going to build these IVs? So the most common way in the literature in migration is to use a measure of past settlements, assuming some kind of networks. We cannot do this because we didn't have past settlements of repatriates in Portugal. So the way we are doing this, we are using their places of birth. So the idea, so we have at least three variations of these shift share IVs. I will try to explain the first two. So in the first one, we are going to predict the location of repatriates using as a share the places where they were born, the places where they were born per educational group, and the shift is going to be the share of repatriates. So the idea is that if more repatriates that are highly educated come from a region, this region is were born in a particular municipality in Portugal, that municipalities predict to attract more repatriates from the same educational group. We extend this idea to also exploit their origin from Africa. So if more repatriates from Angola were born in a given municipality in Portugal, that municipalities predict to attract more repatriates from Angola. The same is when we do this from Angola, Mozambique, and the rest of the Portuguese-speaking countries. And then we also, instead of using the share of repatriates, we use the white residents in colonies in 1907. The results are basically the same. And we are, and then, so we have three variations of the denominator, and we are also, we are predicting the location of natives by using this idea for educational group. This is going to be the same in the three IVs. So then we can build this shift share instrument where we have our prediction of repatriates and the prediction of natives. So using this as our measure, what do we find? So we find that a 1 percentage point increase in the share of repatriates will lead to basically to a 14% to 15% reduction increase in unemployment, a reduction of 0.5 percentage points, and then employment decreases. This is mostly explained by the fact that the share of employees decreases more in places with a higher influx of repatriates. This is for males. Males are able to circumvent this shock, to partially at least circumvent this shock by becoming entrepreneurs. But what kind of entrepreneurs? Not really high quality entrepreneurs, so they don't become employers, so they become self-employed. So they open a small store so they are fired from employees, but they are able to open a small store, to become a taxi driver, something like this. What happens to women? To women, so this is quite different for women. So not only, so they basically leave the labor force participation. So even if they are in the labor force, they become more unemployed and less employed. And this is mostly explained by a huge reduction in the share of employees. And we also see that for the few women that in the 80s were employers in Portugal, even for these, there's a reduction in their numbers. So basically, this result is robust to a battery of robustness checks. So we do this by removing regions at a time to see that the result is not dependent on any NUTS-free region. We also change severely, we also change the sample selection, how we define repatriates, showing that also including those who changed NUTS-free between 1981 and 1979, exploiting a little bit or being more demanding on the age ranges, excluding all inactive repatriates and so on and so forth. We also see if these, since we divide the labor markets for the both genders, we also see if there are, if the gender specific shocks, if they give approximately the same results, and they do. And we also have one IV where that yields robust results, where we also exploit the fact that these large repatriation programs that the governments had to implement, they relied on using all available hotels, sometimes even luxury hotels, to accommodate as many repatriates as possible. So by using these IV on the impact, this IV is especially important for those that are second generation repatriates. If we use this IV, basically we find very similar results. So just to very quickly conclude in less than 1 minute. So several years after a huge inflow of repatriates, we find that this led to a slight increase in male unemployment, but males are able to circumvent this shock partially by becoming more entrepreneurs. But the effect is very different for women. Portugal was a country that with a higher labor force participation historically at that time because of the war and migration. But when in places with more repatriates, there's a larger displacement effect on females. And that's basically all I have to say. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present our work.
Thank you, Joao. So that sort of concludes the formal presentation part of the session, and we'll move now to Q&A with the audience and with the panel. Please put any questions you might have into the chat box, and also panel, please feel free to raise your hand or even just start talking as you wish to ask questions of other panel members. I might get us started, I guess. So I'll start with the question to Angelika. We talk in your paper, you present quite a good case for the impact of under credit constraints, and you describe how those ex-ante credit constraints lead to very particular outcomes. And then you sort of explore the policy implications with respect to those. Do you have a sense of what would happen if you instead relaxed those constraints?
Sorry, I'm not sure if I completely understood your question. Maybe you can repeat.
Sure. So in your discussion, you raised the point that your model basically describes what happens under ex-ante credit constraints, right? My question is, as a policymaker, when you're thinking about the implications of this, what would be the implications then of relaxing those constraints in those areas? So if you're interested in rural electrification, you're interested in trying to stop those migratory behaviors and the bad impacts both on receiving and leaving communities.
Yeah.
Would relaxing those credit constraints have a particular impact?
Yeah, so I think, from my paper, I don't want to claim that it's necessarily bad that we see an increase of out-migration. That's really another question, I think, for another paper, because of course there are also big gains for the migrants from migrating, and there's a reason why they're opting into migration. But I think the point that I wanted to drive home with this is that to really create valid sort of I don't know, valid living options for people in rural areas, it needs more than just creating infrastructure, but this needs to go along with maybe some other like work programs or something like that, so that there's a sorry, I'm blank. Yeah, so it needs to be a package of different programs at the same time to really lift these communities up, and yeah.
Awesome, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Simon, I had a very tiny question for you, which was just with respect to your presentation of your initial ITTs before you got sort of deeper into your estimation strategy. You had extraordinarily precisely estimated impacts for the public works, which are, you know, your positive impacts, and then surprisingly imprecisely estimated effects for the private sector. Do you happen to know why that's the case?
So you mean, are you talking about differences in those standard errors in the
Yes.
in the first set of results? Yeah, well, yeah, so I think it's, yeah, that's pretty straightforward. So basically, if you do public works and your householder does public works, you do exactly X number of hours per week, exactly 20 hours per week, and there's very little variation with it across locations in terms of how many households do it. So basically, like mechanically, every single household in the program does 20 hours of public works a week. And the only variation there, the reason that the standard error isn't exactly zero is that there's different household sizes, and so then it gets distributed across. So yeah, that would be the answer. Yeah, I mean, we do have a lot in the paper which kind of maps out like who exactly is stopping the work, what they were doing before, you know, and we can decompose that within the household as well, like who's doing less work in the private sector because somebody else within the household is doing the public works and so on. But that's in the fine print.
That makes sense. Thank you. I'll then throw a question to Ida, which is with respect to your identification strategy, you're relying on the staggered adoption to get your DID. I have a question about what you might think might be determinants of that staggered adoption, though. As in, I could sort of postulate that there are political economy factors which give rise to particular cities being the ones which are the first movers, which might also be correlated with, say, better outcomes in general. Do you have a sense for why you might think that the sort of distribution of adoption is not quite endogenous?
Yeah, I think the main issue that we had is that it could actually be related to how developed your city is. So considering that throughout this period in China, the main kind of industry was manufacturing, which is very labor intensive, you might think that this model of drawing on kind of rural labor into urban areas could be beneficial for firms in a way. So we think that maybe cities that are more developed in terms of their GDP, which usually reflects their level of industrial development, could have a bit of an incentive, or that could just kind of explain the difference in adoption, or why they adopted at different times, or why some were more incentivized to adopt. So we do control for kind of log per capita GDP, as well as the share of non-agricultural population, to kind of capture how urbanized the place is. And in that, we are really thinking about like which stage of industrialization the town is at as a proxy for, you know, whether the manufacturing industry, which tends to be labor intensive, is like a big component. But there will, of course, also be political reasons that are a bit harder to capture. So, yeah.
Awesome, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And then I guess I have a final question for Joao, and I hope the panel will then ask questions to each other. My final question for Joao is just, migration is very much not my field, so think of my ignorance on this. But is it common for us to have displacement of workers by a relatively skilled workforce? I can think of lots of cases of like quite large scale migration where we might think that relatively less skilled workforces are joining a community, such as we've talked a lot in this conference about climate change related migration. But are there similar cases like this which occur with any degree of frequency?
At least we did not find many cases in the literature of this. So, and that's one of my main interests in this paper, is precisely that, because it's one case where, but it could be that if you think about the migration literature on development settings after so after dictatorships fall, and then there's a lot of people that are outside, that are more educated and so on, and then return. So that could precisely be the case in many contexts, but at least in the literature we have not seen many cases of this.
Awesome, thank you. We have a couple of participants which have their questions. But first I'll throw to Jin, who has a question in the panel.
You're muted.
Thank you. Because we just have finished with Joao, and I have a question to Joao's presentation. So I do acknowledge that there actually has been a labor market impact, but do you have you considered about there is like a product effect? What if those refugees, I mean the Portuguese, they did actually have some kind of a connection with people, right, in their home, and then they kind of got all kicked out and then sent back. So this connection, not necessarily about this labor market, but about the product market, this whole section is actually kind of like got just demolished, this connection. So they actually can be kind of like caused by this product market disruption, not because of this labor market. So I mean, that's kind of my hunch. I think it's a mix of both. How do you think about that?
So you mean that if there is some kind of international trade effects or things like this?
Exactly.
Okay, so these African countries were mainly exporting things like oil, diamonds, and things like this. So there was not a huge connection between these very rural areas in Portugal and the exports that you can think of from these African countries. So what we try to do to deal with these type of issues is by removing regions to see if there are some kind of outliers that could potentially be explaining these connections, and it does not seem to be the case. But it's of course something that we would like to further exploit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. We have a question from the audience from Carol. Carol, I'm going to allow you to unmute yourself, so please jump in whenever you're ready.
Hello, thank you. I have a question to Simon about this implementation of this experiment. So I was wondering what happens there in terms of pricing of labor, where if I remember results right, you saw this kind of net zero effect with people shifting to public jobs at the cost of private sector. So does it mean that some private firms are priced out, kind of that some firms or some businesses private businesses have to exit the market? And does it have any equilibrium implications that you capture? Like, I don't know, like whether this has some distortions on the private activities. And I guess the question is whether this experiment is self-financing, whether this doesn't require any taxation of working population, and if you take care of this as well.
Great, thanks. Those are great questions. I guess maybe sort of starting from the second question, because I think it's important for everything I say, is just that yes, we're considering this as kind of a redistributive program. We're ultimately interested in the welfare of the urban poor, and yes, this is a program that is to some extent funded by taxation. And that's sort of why we're benchmarking it against a similarly sort of tax-funded cash transfer program. I mean, it could be aid-funded as well. This program was supported by a World Bank loan, but ultimately is meant to be paid for by the government of Ethiopia. So we do think about it like that, and we're thinking about kind of the overall poverty alleviation effects relative to other types of programs. And then I guess on private sector wages, it's true, I guess, like almost a lot of the papers we've seen here, some of the papers we've seen increases in wages, and those are coming at the great benefit to workers. But then, of course, there's a sense in which firms may suffer and may be priced out, as you say. We haven't looked at firm data in great detail. We can look at overall employment rates and overall wages in equilibrium, and we're saying that that workers are benefiting enormously, and we're just not considering sort of the welfare of kind of the owners of capital and the owners of these firms. I should say that we do have results both on the private sector wage labor market and self-employment amongst the urban poor. So we're seeing an increase in profits among self-employed in these areas as well. So that's through kind of a different mechanism, that there's kind of a lower competition effect within self-employment type businesses. So I'm not sure, yeah, if that answers your question. It's true, we're not modeling the effects on firms. But that's sort of not primarily what we're interested in.
Makes sense. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Fantastic. Unless the panel has any additional questions for each other, that I see one from Jin. Go ahead.
Okay, so I have a question to Angelika. So I'm just curious whether you did a like regression analysis, not just on migration, but about like education to the children, or if they actually migrated, what kind of job they actually would get, whether they would work in the formal sector or informal sector. Yeah, can you answer those kind of things?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a really good suggestion. So I haven't really looked into the sector of employment of the migrants, but only the people that remain in the region. So I think this is a really good idea. Yeah, also for the education, I think there's still a lot of data that I need to analyze. So thank you.
Yeah, the reason that I'm actually asking this question is because I'm curious that whether with the electrification and then just household is extending their informal market, like labor market activity, or use that electricity to educate their children so that they actually go out and get a job in the more like bigger city. So that's what I'm actually interested in. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I can only tell you about the types of employment that the household head is doing. So this is really informal small business activities in retail and really like these kind of very informal small scale micro enterprises that they start doing. So it's not really linked to larger, I don't know, manufacturing or something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Ida?
Yeah, thank you. I had a question to Simon. I think you mentioned one of the spillover effects that you identify is through local amenities. So I was wondering what goes into kind of construction of that measure, and whether you were able to identify like specifically which channel, like whether there was one amenity that dominated maybe.
Yeah, good question. I have forgotten. We do have that result somewhere, but I've forgotten which exactly it was. It's not just one, it's like three or four out of six are moving significantly, and then there are a couple that aren't. So I'd have to go back and look that up. But yeah, in terms of measurement, it is self-reported. So we're asking people to kind of rate their amenities in all of these different dimensions. And we're seeing that those ratings kind of improving across the board. Yeah, and so kind of our method for valuing them was to say, okay, well, let's look in the cross section across the city, both in our sample and in another database that we have, and show that like the correlation between those particular amenities and rents, is X. And then if we map that into kind of the improvements, that's what we get. I'm gonna have to turn my video off because I think my kid's coming upstairs. But I hope that helps.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Joao?
I just thank you all for the presentation. Just one suggestion to Jin and Ida, sorry. Is that so? You rely on this staggered diff model, but I did not realize if you were using like Calway and Santana or Chasse-Martin or these new developments in the ID literature. Just maybe it was me who missed it, but just to highlight one suggestion will be to highlight what you are using, because people I think will be interested on that. But thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. So yeah, thank you. I'll send you an email, so please just let us know about the specific name. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll happily write down exactly the name. That's helpful. Thank you.
Awesome. I think that's all the questions from the audience. So I guess we should leave it there. And a huge thank you to everybody for attending the session and the conference a whole. It's been fantastic to see everybody. As always, the GatherTown link is still open if people would like to move this discussion there. But thanks again, everybody, for attending.